This episode is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. What is going on, Solo fam? My name is
Dick.
No, my name is
Dick with a D.
No, my name is
Dick!
My name is John Solo, and this is Mythology Explained. So as some of you may know, a new Scooby-Doo movie came out this month. I decided to watch it out of curiosity and also because I'm a man-child, and was very surprised to learn that the main villain's master plan was to summon Cerberus, the guard dog of the underworld, to Earth. If you want to know why, you're gonna have to watch the movie. Or Google it. But the reason I mention it is that I've wanted to make a video on Cerberus for a long time and figured that might be a sign from the muse that I should do it now. Because that's how I decide what videos I'm going to make, by the way. Not audience demand or interest, but what happens in episodes of Scooby-Doo. Now that's of course not the only time Cerberus has been used in pop culture. He's shown in Disney's Hercules, he's a boss in Devil May Cry 5, there's actually more than one episode of My Little Pony that features him, and there's even more examples that we'll talk about later. But despite how popular of a character he is, these portrayals never go much deeper than big scary dog with 3 heads, and it's for that reason that I want to spend today breaking down everything we know about Cerberus. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to hit that like button. Let's try to get at least 3 likes, one for each of Cerberus's heads. Subscribe for more mythological content in your sub box on a regular basis, and most importantly, enjoy. So as usual, let's start with the very basics. Who is Cerberus and what does he do? Well, as we established earlier, the Hound of Hades, as he's also known, is usually portrayed as a giant dog with multiple heads, but there's even more to his terrifying appearance. He's also said to have jagged teeth that produced venom, the tail of a snake, lion claws, and serpents extending from all over his body. One Roman philosopher, Seneca the Younger, also claimed that Cerberus's face was always smeared with the blood and guts of his victims, which the snakes in his mane would pick off and eat. And as if that wasn't scary enough, it's also said that his eyes continuously flashed with sparks like a blacksmith's forge, which, combined with everything else, would probably make me shit my pants if they looked in my direction. Now, interestingly, there has been some disagreement over how many heads Cerberus actually had. In most portrayals, he's shown with 3, but some philosophers and poets claimed he had only 1 or as many as 100, though some of them may have counted the snakes that are all over his bod. There's also some folks who claim Cerberus wasn't necessarily giant, but just larger than average, though I definitely prefer the giant portrayal. Probably the most unique description of Cerberus comes from a 12th century poet named John Tsitsi, who gave him 3 dog heads and 47 other heads that belonged to beasts of all sorts. If the other monsters in the Greek mythos are any indication, those beasts were probably lions, goats, wolves, and maybe a chinchilla. When it comes to Cerberus's personality and temperament, all we know is that he had no pity or remorse, which is no doubt necessary when you're guarding the gates of the underworld. And speaking of, I think the detail I love most about Cerberus is that even though he was a guard dog, he let basically anyone in. It didn't matter if you were alive or dead, whether you were supposed to be there or not, unless he sensed that you were about to cause trouble for his master, he would let you pass. It's when you wanted to leave that there was trouble. If he caught you trying to get back to the mortal plane, he would tear your physical form limb from limb, and your spirit would be forced to reside in Hades for all eternity. So now that we're all more familiar with exactly who/what Cerberus is, let's talk about where all this information comes from and his most iconic role in Greek mythology. The oldest sources that we found Cerberus mentioned in are all books you should recognize if you've watched the channel for a while: Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, and Hesiod's Theogony. Interestingly, Homer doesn't actually describe him or give him a name, but rather refers to him as the Hound of Hades and references Heracles' final labor, where he had to capture Cerberus and take him to King Eurystheus, a myth that was referenced at the end of Disney's Hercules, and one I'll dive deeper into in just a few minutes. Hesiod is the first one to give him both a name and origin, revealing he's the son of Typhon, the most feared monster in all of Greek mythology, and the evil Echidna, known as the mother of all monsters. Hesiod describes Typhon as terrible, outrageous, and lawless, which he plagiarized from my Tinder profile. Typhon was so fearsome that even the gods ran and hid when he attacked Olympus, that is, all except for Zeus, who defeated him with a thunderbolt and cast him into Tartarus. Before that battle went down though, Typhon got busy with Echidna, who Hesiod says was half a nymph with glancing eyes and fair cheeks, and half again a huge snake, great and awful. The two of them had some weird half-serpent sex and gave birth to not only Cerberus, but a host of other monsters, including the Hydra, the Chimera, and Orthrus. The two had a dog who guarded the cattle of Geryon. Now believe it or not, despite Cerberus being such a well-known figure today, there was not that many myths about him. In fact, there's only 2 myths where he's prominently featured, one of which is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which we've talked about before. In it, the musician Orpheus Orpheus travels to the underworld to convince Hades to allow his wife Eurydice to return to the mortal realm after she tragically died while trying to fend off a satyr that was trying to rape her. On his way in, he comes across Cerberus hanging out by the river Styx, and in order to get past him, he plays some lovely jams that put the beast to sleep. So if you were wondering where J.K. Rowling got her inspiration for Fluffy and the solution for how to get past him, now you know. The other myth is the one I mentioned earlier, when Heracles had to capture him for the last of his 12 labors for King Eurystheus. For those who haven't seen my video on that, the reason Heracles had to complete these labors was to repent for the sins of murdering his wife and children after Hera cursed him with madness. Pretty messed up. It's also worth mentioning that Eurystheus didn't actually want to see Cerberus, but simply ordered Heracles to capture him because he thought the task would be impossible. So Heracles enters the underworld through the hidden entrance at Taenarin, the southernmost point of mainland Greece, and was guided through by Hermes and Athena. Hermes was the usual guide of the underworld, and the wise Athena had given Heracles some aid and insight throughout many of his 12 labors. Eventually he reaches Hades and asks for permission to borrow Cerberus, and Hades' response depends on where you source your information. In one version Hades says no, but prior to coming down there, Heracles was initiated into a cult called the Eleusinian Mysteries. This cult was dedicated to Hades' wife Persephone and her mother Demeter, which puts our hero in her good graces, so she does some convincing and Hades finally agrees that Heracles can take Cerberus, but only if he can do it without using weapons. In a different version, Hades gets a bit more specific and says Heracles will have to capture him without shield or iron, so Heracles used his impenetrable lion skin as a shield and made some stone points for his arrows. Apparently this irritated Hades, who didn't realize there was such a massive loophole in his phrasing, but Heracles shot him with one of his arrows before he could do anything about it, and that seemed to convince him. In yet another version where Hades says the shield or iron line, Heracles used his wooden club, much to the god of the dead's frustration. So Heracles dips out and finds Cerberus at the gates of Acheron, one of the underworld's rivers that can be found in real-world Greece. Then, depending on which rendition you like best, Heracles either wrapped the lion skin around Cerberus's heads to exhaust him into submission, bear hugged him until he was out of breath, or choked him using his adamant chains. After Cerberus had been tamed, Heracles took him up to the surface through a crack in the earth, then back to Eurystheus, who, similar to Heracles' previous labors, hid himself in a jar until the terrible beast was out of his sight. Then the multi-headed monstrosity was returned to his owner in the underworld and lived happily ever after, ripping potential escapees into shreds. Now obviously there's a multitude of fantastic creatures found in Greco-Roman mythology, but due to how unbelievable these stories are, there have been many attempts throughout history to ground its more fantastical elements in reality. So instead of just taking every story at face value and believing there really was a giant three-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades, experts try to find the seed of truth that this epic myth sprouted from. For example, Heraclitus the paradoxographer, a word I refuse to say ever again, wrote that Cerberus was actually just a large dog with one head, but had two pups that never left his side, making him appear to have 3 heads. Hecataeus of Miletus said that Cerberus wasn't a dog at all, but rather a giant poisonous snake that lived on the island of Taenarin, which many believe to be the entrance to the underworld. But my favorite comes from a guy named Palaphidus, who wrote an entire book in the 4th century rationalizing several Greek myths. He believed that Cerberus was a regular single-headed dog that guarded the cattle of Geryon along with Orthrus, his allegedly 2-headed brother I mentioned last section, only in reality, he only had 1 head as well. According to Palaphidus, Geryon and his cattle lived in a city called Tricranium, or Trichorenia in Greek, which means 3 heads. Since Geryon and the dogs were trichranites and were referred to as such, this is probably what led to people believing they had 3 heads. He also says that Heracles was a real person who did complete labors for King Eurystheus. For his 10th labor, he had to steal Geryon's cattle and in the process killed Orthrus. Then he used Cerberus to guide the cattle to the king and gave him the hound as a bonus gift. Later on, a Mycenaean named Molossus tried to buy Cerberus from Eurystheus for breeding purposes, but the king said no, so Molossus stole the hound and hid him deep in the cave on Taenarin that was said to lead to the underworld. Heracles then tracked him down, descended into the cave, and brought Cerberus back up, and that is supposedly where the myth of his 12th labor came from. So yeah, that's pretty much everything we know about Cerberus. What do you think? Did you learn anything new about the Hound of Hades? Would you want him as a pet? Should I cover the rationalized versions of these myths more often? Let me know in a comment down below, and while you're doing that, I want to give a special shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. You see their names in the credits every week, but they deserve way more gratitude than that. Thanks to their help, I've been able to make so many improvements to the channel, from paying artists for their work to leveling up old equipment. It means far more to me than I'll ever be able to express, but since there was no sponsor this week, I felt like taking the extra time we have to do my best. So Christian, Elliot, Anna, Greydog, Isreba, Heidi, Stephanie, and the rest of the Patreon fam, thanks a lot. Alright, so let's wrap this up, shall we? If you haven't yet, make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons, especially if you enjoyed the video and want to see more content like this from the channel. Follow me on social media to stay updated on channel news, get hints about upcoming videos, or send suggestions my way. And if you really like Cerberus, then consider following my own little Cerberus as well. He's not even close to being a good guard dog, but he is funny to look at, and couldn't we all use some more laughs right about now? I'll be seeing you guys next week with the reaction video I promised this week before I got too busy, and another episode of Messed Up Origins. Until that day comes, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.